What I want to talk about this time is very difficult material. It's what gets in the way of psychic development and what gets in the way of spiritual growth. It's all those levels of emotion where we hate, where we envy, where we resent, where we're full of grudge holding and spite. If we can't include destructiveness in our spiritual life, there's no spiritual life with any teeth in it. You want love with teeth, not just gumless, so that the first time you come across avarice, sloth, pride, etc., you fall by the wayside. This is particularly crucial for us now, given the recent events in the news, and particularly in Colorado. What gets in the way of a spiritual life is not finding a place in it for our own destructiveness. Instead, what we get is a kind of us-them mentality. Destructiveness is for export only. It's put on the thems, and we remain the us in our group. Whether we're the Serbs with fervent national religious feeling about our country, and we're casting out and killing all the ethnic Albanians, or the Muslims, or whether we're the Croats who, in Bosnia, pushed out 500,000 Serbs in one weekend. Or are we the ones in the black trench coats who are full of narcissistic rage and want to annihilate those who, without saying it in a slurring, down their nose way, well, these people in the trench coat mafia, they're the scum of the school, they're the discards. So the discards band together and become an us and literally shoot down the thems who called them discards. Depth psychology knows all about the us-them mentality. It's talked about in different ways in different treatments, different modality treatments, different theories. It's talked about as a catastrophic wound to narcissism and resulting in narcissistic rage, which, as I said last night, is unrelenting, insatiable, seeks to annihilate and humiliate the other, not just beat them and win. Melanie Klein talks about this us-them mentality as being caught in a persecutory position, which can happen at any stage of our life, not just when we're little, before we've moved on to a later developmental position called the depressive. The persecutory position, destructiveness is for export only. It's projected out, it's located over there in some other person, some other sex, some other group, some other race, some other color, some other creed. But to put things out like that doesn't mean they just go away. They just go beyond the ego's response to them, beyond our control of them. And it won't work to evacuate it, because then we have to control the person onto whom we've projected it. This is not just a psychological issue. It's also a religious one. If you think about it deeply, it leads you to, well, what is evil? What is it? And I would say Jung takes sides with one position, which would be the tragic view that evil exists as a power just the way good does, and they war between each other. Jung found personal peace in his own reinterpretation of the incarnation doctrine, working with his own God images. He found his own personal peace. Whether one can just latch on to what Jung said and not work out one's own position, I highly question. But his position that he found is moving. He said, in effect, the incarnation goes on. It didn't happen just in Jesus. It happens in you and me and everybody after us. And what we incarnate is this conflict between good and evil. So when I'm struggling with my own problems, I am living in service to God. I am working on the problem in reality, in the universe. So that reacting to Littleton, Colorado, we can't just then export the evil again and say, well, it's just this group of kids. Or between Klebold and Harris, it's just Harris. Or it's their parents who are to be blamed. Or it's the internet. Or it's the film industry. That's the same old persecutory position. I can keep the good, and I'll push the destructiveness onto someone else. It won't work. It won't work. It leaves us divided, a divided house and a divided community. Now, the Christian answer, historically, is different from this. It also recognizes that good and evil exist. They don't exist in quite the same way, but they're both definitely real and powerful. The Christian answer is that God enters into the suffering and takes it into the secret, hidden Godhead and resolves it there. The French philosopher theologian Jean-Luc Marion says, other than this position, if we don't see this Christian position, we're stuck with the logic of evil. And the logic of evil, he says, is that evil makes more evil. It starts with imposing on us tremendous sorrow and suffering, and it builds in us a desire to do evil back, to retaliate. First we protest, we didn't do that. We're the us's, not the them's. Then if we accept, well, maybe I did do it, well, you made me do it. And then if I go further than blame, it's I refuse to suffer this unless you suffer too. So it passes from one person to another, one generation to another. The Christian answer in Christ, says Marion, is in essence the buck stops here. He who was innocent takes on the destructiveness as if he were guilty and suffers it until the end. The question then, in our own psychological lives and our own spiritual disciplines, is what is our own answer? Is it Jung's? Is it Marion's? Is it the Christian? What is it? And here depth psychology is very helpful. When I was talking about our God images the last time, they will come to an end because they are finite, and because we use them up, and because life tears them up. It just tears them up with tragedies like the war in the Baltics, the tragedy in Colorado, and we can multiply, the wasting illness, the innocence of children that's violated, and so on. Where can we find the personal root of our own aggressiveness so that it is part of us and not for export only? So that we suffer it and may be surprised what comes from the suffering. Even Christ in the Gospel of Mark, according to Barth, didn't really know in the Garden of Gethsemane when his prayer was not answered that the cup pass from me. Even Christ doesn't know whether the darkness in which he is plunged is the victory of evil over God, or whether God has taken up the evil into God's own plan. Christ as a human being doesn't know. It's only after death something comes back from the other side that is entirely new. Similarly, I would suggest, using some of the theories of depth psychology, that if we struggle to find the personal root of our own destructiveness, we will be surprised what comes back. Now, what do I mean by that? The twin dangers are we deny our destructiveness and park it on our neighbor. The dog goes on the neighbor's lawn, never on mine. The other danger is that one is completely identified with it, as I think Klebold and Harris were. They were completely overtaken by a force of aggression, and they just became the agent of its destructiveness. Symbolic thinking collapsed. Thought became deed. Impulse became action. There was no conversation between the surface mind and the deep mind. There was no space there, no imaginative space in which to imagine what to do with one's enemies. So the first thing in finding the personal root of one's aggressiveness is to acknowledge it, that yes, I would like to turn this person into a toad. Yes, this is not a prince, this is a toad. This is a toad masquerading as a prince. Acknowledge it. That moves us, says Melanie Klein, into the depressive position where we learn soon enough the good and evil, intentions, feelings, contents, actions belong to all of us. In the people we admire, they are good and evil. In our relation to them, those we admire and love, we are also good and evil. That acknowledgement should also be in our prayers, so that none of this pale blue, pale pink, pale yellow praying. Boldness, anger, howling, despair, anguish, help, full force with the ruthlessness of instinct should be in the prayers, as well as receiving into one's consciousness that one has to own these destructive feelings. Like the man who dreamt Jesus died cursing and screaming, he needed to widen his consciousness to include his own cursing and screaming about the situation in his life at that time. At first, this is just flailing around. But if one gets used to it and doesn't run then this kind of instinctive, full-breasted, full gonad, full knee, full ankle, full kicking reaction is joined up with personal feelings of hurt and revenge and spite and grudge. They too need to be acknowledged, and acknowledged in prayer. One of the hardest prayers is to pray that you forgive your enemy when you really want to do a whole list of interesting things to your enemy. And there's a tremendous conflict. It's a kind of cross. To acknowledge these retaliatory impulses makes you feel bad about yourself. There's a big gap between who you are and who you want to be. And if you're feeling them towards somebody you love or admire, you really feel bad because you know you can hurt them. This is not unlike the child who goes at the parent with the full force of instinct and then suddenly thinks, did I leave a hole in Daddy? Did I leave a hole in Mommy? Is there a hole in me? And very slowly, Winnicott would say, the child attaches personal feelings to ruthless instinctive feelings and develops a level of concern. Concern for others can happen only if we find the personal root of our own destructiveness. Because then we know what to be concerned about. Not what the other will do to me, but what I am going to do to the other. And if one can hold that in fantasy and imagination, your fear of the other is much less. And so often with God in prayer or meditation, we're on good behavior, always in dress-up clothes. This won't do. Imagine in your intimate relationships if you always saw your lover in his suit. Love is much more ruthless than that. It wants the down, deep, hidden life where the Spirit dwells. So, we own it. We develop a concern about the intensity of it. And if we can tolerate that, we want to make amends. We want to say, I'm sorry. We want to make a bridge again. We want to give something back. And in prayer, just as in life, confession is confessing all these things and feeling that God is still there, and we want to make amends. We want to give something back. And out of this, says Melanie Klein, for example, come some of our greatest creative contributions. Making a good pie, digging a good garden, having a friendly attitude on a terrible day, painting a painting, talking with a friend, getting a new attitude in prayer. These are all ways of paying back. What's the result? And here Winnicott says something very terse. I've been thinking about it for 4 or 5 years. Because the big question is, well, where does the destructiveness go? It doesn't just vaporize like cotton candy. It's still there. It's still instinct-driven. People still drive you wild. You drive them wild. It's still around. So where does it go if we own it, accept it, experience it, worry and concern about it, and feel this gesture to make amends? What happens to the destructiveness? It goes 2 places, he says. It destroys our projections onto other people and onto God if we're applying it to spiritual life. God is not who I thought God was, but that doesn't mean God isn't there. You are not who I thought you were, but that doesn't mean you're not there. In other words, one of the places it goes is toward the external community. You see the otherness of the other person. They are an independent, objective subject, a source of agency, who may be in your life a source of food. That's very different from assigning roles to people. You should be my mother surrogate. You should be my sister surrogate. You should be my mentor surrogate, and so on. This is really to see the down deep life of the other. That makes the world a big source of food. But the other place it goes, Winnicott says, well, it just goes into the unconscious imagination, and that's all he says about it. So that's what I've been mulling. And this is what I've made of it. In the unconscious imagination, which are these levels of what I was talking about last night, the transcendent, what's beyond the ego, what's beyond the psyche. Imagination ranges far and wide. You destroy the accepted images of everything, so that you're able to see everything freshly, everything creatively. Every lilac bush is new to you. That's becoming like a child again. I think of it like this, that the imagination working less than consciously is like a windshield wiper, wiping off the grit and the slush of accumulated God images, projections onto others, projections on what the good life is, allowing you to see freshly what is there and what is not there. Now I'll close with one example, again from a former student years ago, was assigned to clinical pastoral education, which is working as a chaplain in training under supervision in a hospital, a prison, mental hospital. This person was in Bellevue Hospital in New York City, which is a really crazy place. And she was assigned to the emergency room, and I had a patient who worked there who said, it's a zoo, it's not really a hospital. And of all the city hospitals, it's where the most violent cases, the most drugged out cases, et cetera, are kept. So you're really in medias res in Bellevue. She's a tough student. She's smart, she's aggressive, she was on the ball. She worked there in the summer, hot in New York, humid in New York, and she became increasingly distressed by the danger in the emergency room, people coming in with guns, people drugged out, strangling the nurse, and she felt the security wasn't so great. She was even more distressed. She was also assigned to the baby ward, and there were rows and rows and rows of crack-addicted babies just born, who, she said, never made a sound. They looked like little old men and women shaking in their cribs from the withdrawal of the drug. And she was trying to be a chaplain to them and to the mothers, but the mothers were usually in withdrawal from drugs, and it was a very tempestuous, difficult situation. This goes on and on. Midsummer, she gets up on a Friday, she goes to work, it's hot. She goes to go to the subway, and she starts weeping, and she can't stop. It's like a breakdown. She's just weeping. She's lost herself completely. She has the wit to call a friend who has a connection to a private psychiatric hospital just outside the city in the country. The friend insists and bullies her and takes her up there, and she checks her in for the weekend. My student says, it was just great. It was like therapy camp. I talked to the psychiatrist, I talked to the chaplain, I talked to the psychologist, I talked to the therapist. I felt so much better. By Saturday I said, I'm fine, I want to go home. They persuaded her to stay another couple of days, and the big breakthrough came for her in the psychodrama session. The psychodrama teacher said to her, now you talk to God. You talk to God about what got you weeping so. And she said she was shocked by what jumped out of her mouth. She said, I want to love the poor. I want to love the crazy. I really do believe in you, and I'm trying to be good Christian. But I hate them. I hate them. I hate the indifference. I hate the ignorance. I hate the mothers who won't hold their babies. I can't make it better. I hate the whole thing. Then the psychodrama person said, now you be God and answer you. And again she was shocked. She said, she heard herself say, I have made the sacrifice. I've given my life. You don't have to give up your life. I gave up my life. It's offered. I too weep for those who don't take it. And then she said what she got from it. Psychologically, she realized she was trying to rise above her aggression, that she shouldn't have aggression toward the people she wanted to serve, and that was just ridiculous. She did have aggression. And when she owned it and contained it and rooted it, she had a lot more energy. Theologically, she said, I saw something different. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care or God has abandoned all these people. God is weeping too. God offers what will make the difference, but we have to take it.
We have to take it. You're going to have to take some odd sounds. I don't think it will be excruciating. You may even find it pleasing. But these pieces of music, like all the music of quality, I believe, in this century, don't look to offer pleasure in the ordinary sense. To be pleasing, yes, but more important than pleasing in the ordinary sense, to reach inside us. And in every case, I know enough about the composers, the performers, to know that the reaching inside is the fundamental motivation. And sometimes the fundamental frustration, because how do you know? Well, music is the art of how do you know? The composer may not be a performer, at least a public performer. He or she cannot know by responses in the ordinary sense. But this is not the effort of music. It wants an audience, but it doesn't want an audience that always insists upon its response. This is not a series of Nielsen ratings, successful because of a certain number of records sold or audiences roaring with approval. This is the world where you look in sound to convey something that needs, that demands, that insists upon sound. Religious art in our time has found more real success in the world of sound than in the world of images. The images we talked about, looked at, superb, but not often with religious content. There are a few greater embarrassments than to go into recent churches and look at what's been commissioned in the name of art and religion. To go into such churches, for me, is to go into a state of sin, which isn't the best idea in the world as a motivation for getting to church. But the music which has religious content in our time is of a very different kind. It deals with the destructiveness that Anne was talking about, and doesn't hesitate to reproduce it, but not simply to scare us, but to bring us farther into ourselves, to find not an absolutely flatly determined end, but a broadly opened continuity which will go on far beyond the listening or reading of the music. There are 4 lines of 17th century verse that sum up very well for me what we're talking about. One of the very great poems we have in English is Andrew Marvell's The Garden. And in responding to the garden, and he was so deeply moved by what he found in the art is the word, of horticulture, he couldn't quite find the right words, but he found the right words because he put aside mere description. And he knew the great tradition of Christian iconography in which flowers stand, and the whole growing process of flowers stand for meanings of an iconographic and fairly precise kind. He says here what I mean about pleasure and lack of pleasure and the deeper meaning. Meanwhile, the mind from pleasure less withdraws into its happiness, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. Every flower, every garden experience I've ever had since I met that poem, when it really blooms, produces a green thought in a green shade. I can't tell you what month, I can't tell you how long it lasts, but it penetrates. Blind musicians are examples of what I'm talking about. They see when they hear. One of the greatest of my friends, a brilliant jazz musician, a pianist named Lenny Tristano, was blind. And when he said, "Good to see you," or when you left him and he said, "See you," he meant it. The senses of the soul. He saw what he heard. Duke Ellington, and I'm going to play something of his, began as a visual artist. So good in high school, he was offered a scholarship to Pratt, which is one of the best places to learn art to make a living in Brooklyn. He was growing up in Washington, where he was born. He turned it down, and he became, I think, the greatest of our composers. But everything he ever heard, he saw. To hear Duke, you must see what's in his music. I don't mean a series of images, but I don't mean to discourage those images either. He was always turning things upside down. One of his great delights when he brought people to dinner or when they came to see him and he was eating was to start backwards. He'd begin with a dessert. And he never got over being delighted by the way people were shocked. And he really did end with an appetizer. And the smile got so broad at the end, I thought his ears would fall off each time. In music, everything in a sense goes. And in music, you can deal, as the great poets deal, with the sounds of destruction and face them as, for example, that extraordinary Russian woman, Tsvetaeva, did. She and Akhmatov are two of the very great poets of our time, two great women in poetry. She knew how to suffer because she thought that was the vocation of the poet, and she knew how to find the sounds of suffering. She said, after all, in a Christian world, a poet is a Jew. And she found the sounds for that, not just the images, the sounds. And I'm sorry that we can't reproduce them in English, and I'm not going to chatter in Russian to you. I'm afraid it wouldn't make all that much sense. But if there's no sound, there is no meaning. And of course, I think that the pictures we looked at earlier today were sounding pictures. Well, one of the greatest of the sounders is a Russian woman named Sofia Gubaidulina. I know that's a mouthful, but we have in our Russian background a strange attraction to ridiculous combinations of sounds and words that become names. 3, 4, 5, 6 syllables. One of the problems, if you want to set up a propaganda post in Russian, is you have to use, because the words have to be big, a whole series of hyphens. Because the damn words don't end on the first line or the second. It's a kind of protection against the worst of the politicians. It doesn't do in terms of Soviet work, but it even there had its moments. Gubaidulina, who is now in her 60s and living in Germany, was very successful as a student. She came from the Tartar Republic, way out, cousins to the Mongols. And it's in her work. When she was doing her graduating examination at the Moscow Conservatory, she did very well, and one of the examiners was Dmitri Shostakovich, that great composer. And when it was all over, he turned to her and he said, "I want you to continue making the same mistakes." It's a lovely way to say he thought that her oddnesses were superbly even. Well, I'm going to play one movement from her 7 last words, that is to say, the 7 last words, Christ on the cross. This is what she does with "It is finished." Some of you may remember in the St. John Passion of Bach, es ist vollbracht, a marvelous moment, but most people treating this moment as Haydn, who plays in the background of this work, we don't have time to trace it, does introducing a sweetness and a softness along with the terror. She sees, as Luther did, though she's not written this, it's clear in her music that she has in fact written it, that on the cross, going through all that horror, is everything horrible that has ever been or is or will be. Who hangs on the cross? Every rapist, murderer, all the killers of children, as well as the rest of us who may not have achieved such extraordinary ends. At whatever level of life, everybody is redeemed, or redemption isn't redemption. It's a scam. She takes it very seriously. And in this work, written for a small orchestra and cello and a bayan, which is a Russian accordion, she reaches back to Roman times, Greek times, early Christian times to give us every possible sound. It's brief and it is searing. That's what it was like. The cross was not a sweet diversion on a Friday afternoon. It was loud and unpleasant as well as beautiful and redeeming. Another composer enormously concerned with this kind of interiority somehow translated into sound is a French composer still alive, he's in his 70s, named Charles Cheynes, C-H-A-Y-N-E-S. He writes wonderfully well for the organ, there being in France as a kind of magnificent addendum to the improvisatory tradition, an understanding that in church, especially in that kind of mass which is called à la musique, with music, it is appropriate to have improvisation under the distribution of communion, and equally appropriate to have concerts after Mass. And in French conservatories, they teach improvisation as we do, where we teach jazz, as we should indeed if we can find people who know it well enough to teach it. Cheyne is related to Olivier Messiaen, that giant among present-day composers. He's dead, but he's still very much of our time. And he's written extraordinary work about négritude, the understanding which the French, who occupied so much of Africa, came to, and the Africans in certain parts of Africa, Senegal with particular greatness of insight, the understanding of what it meant to be black in the black continent, not in some simple-minded rhetoric, but in a depth that produced poetry and art and music and made one think where and who one was. We who have made Africa into a kind of vapid generalization, as if all these very different cultures were the same, don't follow as Cheyne did, looking for the very precise elements that could not be described except musically. Because you can sound meaning in a way you cannot picture it, even though I believe so strongly, as I've said, that in the beginning was the image. But images can be sounding images. Here he's dealing in a work called À la recherche du sacré, looking for the sacred. He's dealing in particular in the piece I want to play for you with a fleeting vision of medieval mysticism of all things. Brazen attempt, and successful. He says, in effect, he's going from the Roman cloisters to the mysticism of St. John of the Cross. And he quotes St. John in his notes, "On this splendid night where no one else could see me, with no guidance and no light other than the one burning in my chest." We don't know enough about John. We know a good deal, but still not enough, because with a mystic we can never know enough. John was a sounder. There is no greater erotic poetry on earth than his poems written about the contemplative experience, the transcending, the transfiguring experience of becoming first illuminated by God and then one with God. He who was put away by Carmelites who didn't like his kind, Teresa of Avila's kind of reformed Carmelite doctrine, in a little room 6 feet in all dimensions, reduced to a piece of bread and a sardine a day for food, who recovered from that, wrote the poetry, and then on the poetry commentaries that become what remains, I think, the greatest of mystical theologies on paper. He offers us the opportunity, he offers Charles Cheyne the opportunity to produce a music that exalts, that somehow tries to recover the becoming one with the Creator Spirit. That Veni Creator summoned, really summoned in a few minutes. I'll play just part of it. It's too long to play all of it, but I think you get it. It's very quiet and very loud at the same time, because the clamor is for understanding. That's cruel, but the cruelty is in aid of something very good. In time, I hope you will come to hear more of that. Not simply this work, but of the French organ, Messiaen, Tournemire, Langlais, Vierne, Cheyne, who write to draw out of the organ that fullness of sound which can be measured by no other instrument, by no electronics, which is alive here as almost nowhere else, except in the great jazz of this country. And I'm going to play you something by my great master and teacher and friend, Duke Ellington. You will want to think more of the singer who is not Duke Ellington. He wasn't a soprano. Alice Babs, but it's in honor of Duke. It's out of Duke. It's a piece actually written by his extraordinary alto man for so many years, Johnny Hodges, who looked like and was called by his friends Rabbit. He didn't sound like a rabbit, but he had an appetite like a rabbit's. And you'll hear some of this in Jeep's Blues. And that opening to the sound of the human when it joins the instrumentalist to remind us that anything we sounds out of human sound. I don't think I need say any more. You will hear it. That's religious music. We have time for the briefest kind of exchange now before we come back after lunch to talk about the implications of some of these sights and sounds, these senses of the soul, for our meetings.
I have a question about aggression.
I heard that laugh.
Well, I'm laughing because it's not very funny. A lot of literature coming out of feminist criticism and thought has challenged us to think about, I think, differences in experience between women and men. And there's been a lot of criticism about the way violent women have been depicted, say, in the image of Salome or Judith, by men artists. I'd like to hear a few thoughts about differences, as you see them, between aggression as it may appear in women's experience and action, and aggression as it appears in men.
Well, that's a tidy little topic. I think one of the things that we need to remember in the feminists urging us to recover the feminine aspects of God, or even to think of God as female, that again is a group image, a subjective image, which is a ladder toward what we need individually and as a people to appropriate, because the feminine has been neglected and denigrated, really. But what we often forget, if we're suggesting that, is the primordial slime sides of the feminine, both in individuals, in groups, and in the symbolic depiction of the feminine. We have a friend who used to say to us, I'm thinking of Ruth, oh, well, now, if women had all been doing this in the State Department, we wouldn't be having any war. And I just snort up my nose and say, this is ridiculous. There's a kind of primordial aggression that is absolutely fierce, ferocious. It's the little old lady in the television commercial who lifts up the car to get her favorite ice cream. See, let alone the woman who lifts up the car to save her bear cub. So it isn't as if the men have all the aggression and the women don't. And it isn't as if female types of aggression, which show up all over the place, you don't have to read psychology to get at it. Agatha Christie has a wonderful story about a least favorite daughter of a judge and his wife who the mother thinks murdered the husband's mistress. And she's discussing it with her husband judge before dinner, and she says, well, if it's true, you'll just have to get her off. And the judge is simply horrified. What do you mean, get her off? Justice is justice, and the principles are principles. She says, don't be ridiculous. It's blood. Get her off. It's that kind of immediate, in the midst, which men possess too, at least in my own interpretation of the feminine. It isn't as if you're one or the other. You each have both aspects in different arrangements. I think we criticize the macho, penetrating, etc. business of men, but some of that's destructiveness for export only. Judith is a magnificent figure. Barry, I know, will want to say something about her. Tremendous determination out of love for her people to use her sex to win for her people by beheading her one-time lover, Holofernes. It's there, it's primordial, it's not just poisonous or indirect, it's from the fundament. It's frightening. It may be stronger than what we attribute to men. I think I'll leave it at that.
You remember that in Scripture it says, male and female created he them. Us. We did a book together called Transforming Sexuality about the anima and animus archetypes. There is no all male, there is no all female. We make more or less conscious use of our contrasexuality, the male and the female and the male. But to understand aggression in these terms is to understand we must reach farther and farther all the time, looking for a consciousness of the various disguises. Judith is the great example. I loathe the term we give to certain volumes, great works, apocrypha, because of problems, I think, some of the early fathers of canonicity. Judith seems to me as one of the giant parts of the Bible. And I cannot do spiritual direction without using Judith in the early meetings, because hers is such an extraordinary reach out of the fullest, most positive aggression, though it results in the beheading of a man, into the possibilities of this great force with which we're all endowed, and a few great women, like a few great men, have made such magnificent use. That's what Gubaidulina is doing on the cross. That's what Alice Babs is moving so exultantly into. In his sacred services, his sacred concerts, Duke in the last years of his life used Alice's voice and others as well, instrumental voices, to talk about what Jesus was trying to do, because he could find in a woman's voice what he could not find in a man's voice, the necessary prayerful aggression. Please, if you have the time, sometime, and you must have the time, read the Judith of the Bible, and if you can find it somewhere, Jean Giraudoux' Judith, it's translated, a magnificent play that makes an extraordinarily adroit use of this beloved woman.
I have a question that pertains both to sounds and images. You spoke last night about being open-minded, but I wonder if you think sometimes, or do you think that everything an individual artist feels should be and can be expressed in the public arena, or are some matters not fit or productive for public consumption?
Well, many are not fit for public consumption because the artists are so untalented. But he's talking about something, asking about something of really great importance. Some art must be sheltered until it's ready to be exhibited, sometimes years after the artist's life. Some art is like a journal, like a diary. It's not because it is too penetrating into the privacies that we'd rather some of us never meet, though that is an issue. It's because there is a deeper pornography, the pornography of listeners and viewers who can only see the surface. And it's an affront to the artist and to the rest of us to be stuck with that kind of listening and viewing. But as for a content, well, I worry about a content which is less that of art than of commerce, the violence and sleaze that we get in certain mass art, which we should not call art. It is so clearly artless. But the privacy issue, the withdrawal from circulation issue that I'm concerned about, that seems to me enormously important, is that we should give any artist, especially one really gifted with sound and images, the alternative of holding what he has to say, of what she has to draw or sound, for however long it makes sense. Because it may be that we're not strong enough. I don't know how we make those judgments, but I honor those where they've been made, and made to our advantage as we've discovered in later years what was involved. One example is what we've finally begun to see now, a year and last year and this year after the 100th anniversary of the life of Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, great logician. We've finally begun to get some of his private papers. He may have written as many as 100,000 letters. Talk about corresponding with grace. Now we're beginning to get some of these things, which he, a very, very retiring man, though he published these things, didn't want out for everybody to see. Now we can. It may at times take a century of privacy before the public can be let in. Time? Good.
Anne mentioned early on that she had some more shocking images of God that if we were willing to push for them, and I am here to push.
Well, here's one that comes to mind that was shocking to the dreamer, who was a woman, who was a priest, and was certainly unusual in my clinical experience, but not in my symbolic experience, because there are archetypal antecedents to it. She was a short-term client because she was moved to another part of the country. But the numinous dream for her, the God image dream, was of a woman sitting with her legs up and parted, exposing her vagina, vulva, etc., to the dreamer, the dream ego. And in the dream, not in the association, this was an alter Christus. This was a Christ figure. Now, for the dreamer, this represented on a personal level whole chunks of herself, literally, that had not been assimilated, were not acceptable to being part of her life on the body level, just the literal level. But in addition, it was the female presence and the reproductive, sexual, passionate, orgiastic level of joy that wasn't included in her theology. She was a very good soul. She worked in one of the big city churches that feeds over 1,000 homeless people a meal. And they serve 3 meals a day. So this was what was missing. But to call this a Christ figure, this was shocking, etc. And there's the aggression, you see. Or I would have mentioned the female ancestors of Christ would be examples too. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, all, not Bathsheba, but all the others, very aggressive. Now the symbolic link, which she didn't know about, which fortunately I did, because I don't always, is of Baubo, who's the only goddess who made Demeter laugh when she lost her daughter Persephone to Hades, which was another kind of sexual underground, chthonic, chaotic experience. Demeter was weeping, and winter was forever, and Baubo sat there like this, made her burst into raucous laughter. So it was the beginning of spring beginning to come. They can be violent, they can be sexual, they are, as Felicity mentioned last night, the least among us. The goat that's in the sheep parable, they're the least among us. They're the stone that the builder rejected. That's where you'll find your most shocking and most numinous God image. That's where it will barge in and introduce you to another level of being.
Just one short addition. Every level of being. In Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's God the Father has as his first name kind of gathering of evolution, Humphrey Chimpden Earwicker. But then you discover that what he means is the set of initials HCE. Here comes everybody.
Thank you. Before we go to our break, I just want to announce 2 further things. Since we have the books and the book signing, I want to say a brief word about the books that are available. For those of you who are absolutely new to Anne and Barry's work, I highly recommend Primary Speech, A Psychology of Prayer, because it's very accessible. You don't need any background to get right into it. Also, a classic of theirs is Cinderella and Her Sisters, The Envied and the Envying. Now, this is a little bit more challenging, but I guarantee you that if you're willing to face envy, you'll get a lot out of reading this book. Also, The Witch and the Clown, Two Archetypes of Human Sexuality. For those of you interested in Jungian theory, this is looking at anima and animus image. And as Anne said, we need to remember that male and female are in all of us. We only have one physical body, but within us we've got everything. This book talks about two of those archetypes. Also, two of Anne's books, The Wizard's Gate. This is about her work with a woman who, as it turned out, was dying, and this woman's discovery of herself in that process. I hope they would agree with these short summaries I'm doing. The Functioning Transcendent is a book that assembles many of Anne's essays on her clinical work, and for those of you who are therapists, that would be particularly interesting to you. There's one other book that is new to me, Men and Women. That is a collection. We regret that we could not get in print so many of their wonderful books, and so I do hope that if you have your original brochure that was sent out, you'll look at all the titles that are there and find the other books in your library. So that's one announcement. The second is, when we come back from lunch at 1 o'clock, we will have a longer period for questions at the end. Please do hold your questions for that group time. I know it's very tempting to try to pull the speakers aside and get questions in, but if you've ever spoken to a large group, it takes a lot out of you, and they do need their rest time during the breaks. And if you really can't bring yourself to ask a question in the whole group, but you want to write to them, see me, I'll give you their address, and they're one excellent correspondence. I'm sure you can write to them. Yes. Okay, food announcements, here we go.
And I think you had also said you wanted to make sure that folks knew to buy your books at the table right here in the lobby, and then go to the book signing, which is in 122. And the table has been set up at the far end of the room for the Ulanovs. In terms of food today, we have three options. There's a chicken salad, a tuna salad, and a vegetarian. There were 4 people who I think specifically designated vegetarian. I have pulled 4 boxes with their names on them at the far end of the table where the boxes are, just so you know that. And there's a list on the front end of the table to tell you which box has what food in it. You are able to go around both sides of the table, so we can move the crowd along. You're more than welcome to go outside today and sit in this wonderful day to enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much.
Great. See you back at 1.